Hi guys, Mr. Halp here, and this is our final lesson of Unit 6. So as you can see, this is 6G, and it's also, that means the last of our little bags of tricks that we've got at our disposal for increasing our rhetoric, either via avoiding or identifying logical fallacies, rhetorical fouls, or in increasing and intensifying our use of diction and syntax, or of course, better using appeals such as logos, pathos, and ethos. So it's a big unit. There's a lot of terms. There's a lot of options to pull from in terms of these terms. But again, it's giving you that sort of flexibility when the time comes to embrace the rhetoric and the rhetorical situation in a way that you might not do, you might not feel compelled to do or be inspired to do if you had never encountered these kinds of strategies and figures along the way. So without any further ado, I'm going to talk about rhetorical figures for syntax. So we're no longer talking about, playing around with the words or the language in terms of what it means. Now we're playing around with like word order or the location and things of that sort, okay? So these will hopefully, make a lot of sense as we get into them, and you'll see how they fit into that overarching category. So we start with anaphora, repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive phrases, clauses, or nouns, or lines, So somebody who says, I want peace, I want clarity, I want a new life for us all. Okay, so you can see how that falls into that category, and that's to some degree that climactic concept that we've talked about in the recent past. It builds off of that idea. It has a rhetorical effect above and beyond just saying, I want peace, clarity, and a new life for us all. No, I want peace. There's that deliberate kind of pause there. I want clarity, another longer pause, and a new life for us all there. All right, so that's an anaphora. We've got zeugma, which will be followed in just a second by diazeugma. This is the use of a word such that it operates in two grammatically similar but different ways, producing incongruous meanings. Wow. Okay. If you can come up with an example based on that definition off the top of your head, you're practically a genius. But I think this example will show you exactly what we're talking about. She broke his heart and his car. Okay. All right, you can see where we're going with this, okay? She didn't literally break his heart. She figuratively broke his heart, but she probably literally broke his car. So we're using that word broke in two very different ways in that particular case. That's what makes it a zeugma, okay? We've got synchrisis, a figure that reframes an argument by using parallel structure to show how two entities are equal, greater, or lesser than one another. Okay, so it's specifically setting up this sort of dichotomy among perspectives and arguments. So taking a look at that example, we've got, you see them as challenges, but I see them as opportunities for growth. So keep in mind, the before the comma and after the comma, they're talking about the same topic. It's the same topic before and after the comma. However, we've got a very different definition on the left and a very different definition on the right. And that's looking at the same topic very differently because of that parallel structure that you've got embedded within that particular example, okay? We would have the diazeugma, okay? So standing the zeugma on its head. This is a figure that uses a single subject to govern a succession of verbs, okay? So now instead of having a different sentence for each individual verb, we've got it's all part of the same sentence. So she opened the door, she smiled at them, and she greeted them all. Okay, so think about that. If you were trying to make that sound more like a zeugma, you would say she opened the door, period. She smiled at them, period. She greeted them all, period. So that's the big difference between a diazeugma and a zeugma, okay? We've got the anadiplosis, a figure that builds one thought on top of another by taking the last word of a clause and using it to begin the next clause. And there's no better demonstration of this in the history of humanity than, of course, Master Yoda. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. So you can see how that final word of each particular sentence becomes the subject of the following sentence. That's your anadiplosis in that case, okay? And so we come down, of course, to word swap, changing normal usage and grammar for effect, okay? So this is really sort of playing around with how the language would typically be undertaken. So you'll see it says, the room was filled with a cacophony of silence, which means a lot. And it all makes sense. But it is also a bit of that paradox as well, because cacophony we assume to be loudness and volume, and yet in this case, it's so remarkably silent that it almost accomplishes the same end goal as a loud noise, okay? So we're swapping out one word for the expected word in that particular case, all right? In a way that kind of produces a paradox, all right? Chiasmus, we've got the crisscross sentence in which the contents of the sentence are subsequently repeated in reverse order. So you literally say a sentence, you flip it all around, and then you say it all over again. And somehow, in some way, it's going to make sense. And of course, if you've heard this example, then you know this is a perfect demonstration of it. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That is a chiasmus in this case, all right? So it's all the same words, just flip-flopped around to have a meaning that is a lot more important when you do something like that, okay? And the last thing I'm going to bring your attention to, it's kind of one that, you know, I could teach whole lessons on this, particularly as the person who sort of teaches the film studies class here at the high school. But it's one of those things that really, if you are familiar with cinema, if you are familiar with movie-making techniques, stop and think about them sometimes and how they might manifest themselves within your writing, particularly within your rhetoric. Because one of the options that govern my writing in a lot of cases, as a film enthusiast myself, is this conscious application of film art to the development of the contemporary essay. You know, it's almost like I think to myself, if I were making a movie, how would I tell the story? And then how would the telling of the story in the movie translate into something more unusual or unique in the writing of an essay version of that? Okay, which may sound like, that sounds like a whole lot of thought in that case, but it's something that good writers are going to invariably do. Okay, so what am I talking about in this situation? Well, I'm only giving you 3 terms from filmmaking to consider in this case. There are literally probably hundreds of different filmmaking terms that you could be pulling out. These are just a good demonstration of what it is that I'm trying to apprise you of as we talk about this concept of cinema technique. So maybe you've heard these before, maybe you haven't. First, we start with montage. So in case you don't know anything about montage, it's the process of cutting and arranging films so that short scenes are presented in rapid succession. You see this a lot in like sports films because there's usually the training montage, where you see 100 different short snippets of this person training, set probably to some background music that's really thrilling and inspiring before we actually get to the big game or whatever the case may be. Well, ask yourself the question, could I do something like that in a rhetorically minded essay? And the answer is, of course you can, okay? So think about what I just described. Little tiny snippets, little tiny images of things to craft an overall big picture of a larger thing in a condensed time period. You can absolutely do this. I can see that working well even with a whole plethora of incomplete sentences, having sentence frags throughout there, okay? That would absolutely be a great thing to do in the right situation if you think it's going to rhetorically help your argument. I know you guys all know what the zoom is, you know, a zoom lens, a zoom shot, zoom whatever work, camera work and whatnot. Intense enlargement of a subject. So think about that. You're describing something. You know that description is one of our modes of development and whatnot. But let's assume that in the process of describing that one thing, you go in and focus in on one key tiny little detail, okay? You say, whoa, I mean, yes, we're looking at the big picture, but I'm going to zoom in for a moment on just that one little 1% of the entire product. Yeah, that sometimes has rhetorical value. Another one, and we do see this a lot in writing, and certainly something that you could be doing. I know it's something that Aldous Huxley does all the time. If you've ever read Brave New World, I think it's chapter 3, is pretty much just cross-cutting, 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 shifting between 2 different situations or ideas repeatedly to indicate simultaneity or thematic connections. So imagine that. In a movie, the way this plays out is, maybe there's one person, maybe it's a husband and wife, and the husband is at home and the wife is at work, and it'll cut to a 20-second scene of the husband, and then a 20-second scene of the wife, and then a 20-second scene of the husband, and then a 20-second scene of the wife. And that's cross-cutting right there. You're shifting back and forth, and we're supposed to assume either what they're doing has some sort of connection to one another, or that it's happening at the exact same time. That's something that you could do in writing, okay? Maybe shorter paragraphs that jump from context to context. Not too many contexts, or then you're going to be sort of veering off into montage, but from context and back again, context to back again, and so on and so forth to do that, okay? And like I said, this is just sort of supposed to be thought-provoking to you right here, right now, because I could teach a whole class on just translating cinematic techniques into the written word, but I obviously don't have time for that. So I'm challenging you guys, think of other unique filmmaking techniques that you have observed and consider how they could be applied to the art of rhetoric. And if you could revolutionize rhetoric and the process of doing so. So think about what you see on screen, and not specifically what you see, but how it's organized, how it's presented, how it's structured. That makes for some really great writing when people try to adapt that into something new and fresh. So that's it, okay? Hopefully you say to yourself, man, after Unit 6, I've got an enormous bag of tricks. Little stressed out about the test, but I got an enormous bag of tricks, okay? Because that's really what I want. And really, having concluded Unit 6, we're really kind of done with rhetoric as a unit of study. Pretty much all of Units 1 through 6, we're all talking about this rhetoric stuff. And now we're going to be getting into 7, 8, and 9, and 7, 8, and 9 are all going to be a lot more specific to say, okay, but how do we do a rhetorical analysis? Okay, but how do we do a synthesis? Okay, but how do we do an argumentative essay? And it's really pulling from that grab bag of rhetorical techniques that we've been developing over these past 6 units and applying them and interpreting them and discovering them in other sources and so on and so forth. So all of this rhetoric that we've been studying from day 1 of the school year till now is there, A, for you to use in your writing, and B, for you to try to suss out of other people's writing. So I hope that you're prepared for that. The class is going to experience a bit of a shift as we start to focus a little bit more on those genres of writing and actually applying all of this rhetoric garbage that we've been looking at. Okay? So as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class the next time I see you. And I will miss you guys. I will see you shortly.